This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, standing in for Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by AASA, that's AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I encourage you to take a look at AASA's website and to follow them on social media. You can join the organisation for $60 Australian if you're a waged academic, or just $15 Australian if you're a student, unwaged or precariously waged. This episode is also brought to you by the Animal Public's book series from Sydney University Press. The 1st of April saw the release of Animal Dreams, a collection of essays by David Brooks, the Australian author, poet and animal activist. To learn more about Animal Dreams and all the other books in the series, take a look at the Sydney University Press website. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Professor Karen Bradshaw. Karen is a Professor of Law and the Mary Sigler Fellow at Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. She's also a faculty affiliate scholar at the New York University School of Law Classical Liberal Institute and a senior sustainability scientist at the Global Institute of Sustainability at Arizona State University. She's received scholarly and popular recognition for her contributions to questions around environmental law, administrative law, land use law, and natural resources law, and was awarded the 2020 Stegner Young Scholar Prize in recognition of her legal scholarship. Today, we're going to be talking about her book Wildlife as Property Owners, A New Conception of Animal Rights, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2020. Welcome to the podcast, Karen.
Thank you, Josh. I'm delighted to be here.
So can you start by telling us what inspired you to work on this question of animal property rights?
Sure. I guess there are really two answers to that question, right? The first is that I grew up in wildly natural places. So I spent the first 18 years of my life essentially outdoors, where I was constantly observing animals and plants and trees and seasons. And so when I entered law school, when I entered the academic community, I brought that background with me quite unconsciously. And so that set of very early fundamental embedded interests lay dormant for a number of years, but were always there. More immediately to this book and this project, I was interested in jaguars. Arizona, the state I live in within the United States, has a phenomena where jaguars that have long lived outside of the state are now coming over the border from Mexico into Arizona. And it's created a number of political and social issues within the state. So I had been teaching my environmental law class about that and decided to read a book about jaguars and learned in it that they practiced essentially a property behavior of building 4 to 5 foot mounds at the edges of their territory, the sole reason of which appeared to be to mark territorial boundaries. And I remember when I read that in the book, I jumped out of bed where I was reading the book in the middle of the night and wrote, "Jaguars are practicing property." And that began a years-long journey of looking at scientific study of animal territoriality through the lens of property law.
Now, this is a very wide-ranging book, and so by necessity, we can only cover some of what you explore. But actually, the first thing I wanted to ask you about was exactly what you were just talking about, the territorial property behaviours of wild animals. You see some real links between property rights and animal behaviour. Would it be accurate or fair to say that you see property rights as something that exists in the animal kingdom prior to their recognition in human political and legal structures?
I do think that the existence of property behaviors, I'm not certain that I can say property rights necessarily, but property behaviors are undoubtedly documented for decades, if not centuries, by scientists around the globe who are studying species on all of the so-called branches of the tree of life, right? This is something that scientists who specialize in the study of ants, mammals, creatures throughout the world, certainly birds, they have looked at the ways in which animals are sharing resources within their species and the way in which they're dividing individual and communal areas and how they mark, protect, defend, and dispute about those areas. And when I looked at hundreds of scientific studies charting these territorial behaviors, it became quite clear to me that what we think of as property when it's practiced by human is really territoriality by another name in many, many ways. And so I think it's quite fair to say that perhaps what humans think we're doing in this distinct way of property law might in fact largely be codification of biological principles about how a species shares space with other members of the same species in ways that are evolutionary advantageous and responsive to the physical environment.
That's one of the foundations of your argument, as I understand it, is this relationship between biology and property. One of the other foundations is human law. And one topic that you visit several times in the book that I think will be of real interest to many listeners is the fact that animals are recognized as property holders or something like property holders in the legal traditions of some indigenous peoples of North America. So, what role does indigenous thought play in your argument?
I think it's important to recognize that colonial law in the United States, which is essentially the importation of English common law to the United States at the period of colonization, did not, as it's often told in popular culture, suddenly bring law to a country that had none. In fact, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's An Indigenous People's History of the United States says that there was extensive government, economic systems, market, and law in place with hundreds of indigenous governments. And so my work encourages scholars to look at the pre-existing indigenous laws that were in place at the time of colonization and explore what rights might exist for animals, plants, and other natural objects. The idea being that if we truly are committed to this idea of English common law as the governing law of property, there exists this doctrine of customary law, where if a law was enacted before a certain point in history, then that customary law might supersede subsequent statutory laws. And we might think that this argument could be made to suggest that indigenous laws that were in existence at that time, which we can recognize through a variety of sources, including oral histories and traditional ecological knowledge, if those laws were established at that time, there might be arguments that they were in fact never extinguished and might apply today. So in this way, we could link very old indigenous legal traditions and indigenous governments to the modern movement among some indigenous cultures in the United States today that are establishing rights for natural objects such as wild rice or the Klamath River in California. So I think it's important to note I am not an indigenous scholar. There are many indigenous scholars who are doing really important and interesting work on these subjects, but I merely flag the opportunity to employ this, I believe, previously unused tool of customary law to link the modern efforts to establish rights of nature to property law through the use of this customary law.
So let's get to the kind of positive proposal. What would it look like to grant wildlife or to grant animals property rights?
So it's interesting because the first stage of granting animal property rights is merely recognizing the widespread rights that animals already have. So throughout the United States today, many public lands, for example, which make up approximately 1/3 of the United States, over 600 million acres, are devoted in part for wildlife or animal uses. And I argue in the book that this, in fact, establishes some sort of property-like interest for wildlife already. So the first step is simply recognizing that our system of property already allows wildlife and other animals to own and engage in property in some way, and brings to light this pre-existing set of relatively widespread property rights for wildlife. The public lands are only one example of the many that I provide in the book. So that's really the first stage, is simply recognizing that we already share not only our physical world with wildlife, but we also share this construct of property and law and property rights with animals already. I think the second step is to leverage and expand upon these rights. So my book does not argue for forced redistribution. It doesn't suggest that we need to take land from landowners to give to animals, but it instead creates another pathway so that people who are interested in providing wildlife habitat have another tool in their belt. It doesn't stop the sort of existing statutory regimes that we have. It doesn't even displace them necessarily. It simply gives another opportunity for private parties with resources who are interested to move forward with allowing animals to own formally on paper. And what that looks like is essentially creating ownership structures. A trust is a common example, but you could sort of substitute a trust, which is a specific legal form in the United States, with any way of ownership and simply expanding the category of who can own from humans and the other sort of creatures or entities that can own an existing law. I'm thinking of ships and corporation, which can own property in the US, and expanding that category of ownership to animals as well. And I think over time, there's good evidence that there's public will and resources for the preservation of habitat. I think over time, we can imagine a landscape in which animals have exclusive land that's established in trust for them, but also partial interest on privately owned human lands.
Do you think that these arguments are unique to the American legal system? Or do you think that similar kinds of arguments could run in lots of legal systems?
Absolutely. I think the fundamental argument is our institutions, government, law, and economics, must be expanded to incorporate ownership interest for other non-human animals, right? And so once you accept that precept, skilled attorneys, lawyers, legal scholars in virtually any legal tradition can imagine ways to expand the rights and interests that are afforded to humans to non-human beings. And so, although the specifics might range, right, like the trust instrument may not exist in every country, the creativity and mindset that lawyers use every day, that legal scholars use every day, can easily adapt to the localized governance and condition to expand the rights of animals, and specifically the rights of animals to own land and resources to ensure its long-term and perpetual use for their interests.
Now, one puzzle that really struck me as I was reading through the book was about the relationship between animal rights and what has been called and what you've just referred to as the rights of nature. So, you do talk quite a lot about animal interests, but I think it's fair to say, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the primary concern is with the preservation of ecosystems, with the preservation of biodiversity, the slowing of species loss, rather than the suffering and death, for example, of individual animals. And I was really drawn to your discussion in the conclusion, where you address this kind of question head on. So, this is just the opening lines of your conclusion. You say, at the beginning of this book, I suggested that my proposal speaks to the rights of nature movement. Yet the wildlife at the heart of it are merely a synecdoche for nature. In my framing, animal property rights are essentially animal rights as right holders to ecosystems. A parallel framing of animal property rights is as ecosystem property rights. I'm wondering whether really animals are at the centre of what you're proposing here. And if they're not, I wonder why you chose to focus on animals in this project.
Great. So I think this reflects in some ways an evolution of my own understanding as much as it is a strategic choice. But both individually and societally, I think that animals and wildlife are a gateway drug, if you will, to nature. So because there are non-human animals that we interact with and are able to more closely recognize as having shared qualities with, right? We are able to connect with animals in some ways first and most easily among natural objects. And as our relationships with nature deepen, as one spends more time outdoors, one can begin to understand the ways in which plants, for example, also exhibit many of these same characteristics. And so as we look more deeply, we find ourselves and our place in nature more and more. And some might be shuddering right now thinking this is anthropomorphism, right? I'm saying that nature is worthy of knowing because it is like humans. And that's absolutely not the case, right? I think that's true for many people. I don't think that that's the philosophical take that I personally ascribe to, but I think it's true for many people that that's the way in which this evolution of a relationship with nature begins and then occurs over time. And so by framing the arguments that we are co-participants with every other living thing on this planet in a shared global experience, that's a very sweeping thing that becomes somewhat hard to understand or connect to. But if we take it down to wildlife or animals and begin at that level, it's easier to develop the arguments. We can understand the ways in which bees and ants and wild creatures of all kinds, even animals inside human homes, right? Domesticated animals are interacting in ways that might parallel our own. So by beginning the argument and really establishing through the first 9 chapters of the book, the argument through wildlife, I established the key points without having to make first the broader argument that we exist equally with every other living thing. And I hope that in those 9 chapters, I'm able to set forth a relatively persuasive set of examples that show these linkages between humans and animals. And then as a parting thought in the conclusion, I show the ways in which really this is true, indicative of a much broader set of relationships that we can have within the natural world, and that everything I say about animals might equally be true for plants and other living species. So really we're coexisting within and as a part of entire ecosystems. So if you buy the argument for animals, so too ought you buy it at the ecosystem level. And then really we're sort of looking at how this connects to the broader rights of nature movement. But I personally, right, developed that line of thinking and went down the line of argument, beginning with animal examples and then leading to this much broader conclusion. So in that way, it's truly a reflection of my own thinking as I worked on this project over a series of years. That was my evolution, but I think is also a helpful way to lead people to the broader conclusion.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And that perhaps marks a distinction between the approach that you're taking here and the animal property rights approaches that were previously featured on Knowing Animals. So I think it was actually the very first episode of Knowing Animals was an interview with John Hadley, who's someone you mentioned in the book. And we've also recently interviewed Connor Campor, who has another animal property rights view. But these are views that are grounded in facts about particular animals, or often seem to be grounded in facts about particular animals, whereas your view is that bit more expansive, it seems, because it's able to move beyond particular animals with particular capacities to encompass all of nature.
I do think that I take a somewhat broader view. It's interesting because when we start looking at the capacities of animals, which I know is a very frequent argument, not only for animal property rights, but also animal rights and animal rights litigation specifically, there are very frequently comparisons between humans and animals. In the animal rights context, for example, one often hears the argument that primates are deserving of some degree of legal rights akin to, although not fully, human rights, because they have human-like capacities to feel, to have sensitivity, to employ language, etc. Right? So through the comparison to humans, primates are said to be close enough to be deserving of rights. And although I understand these arguments in the animal rights context, I don't personally subscribe to that as even accurate, in the sense that I think humans use somewhat false metrics of what matters to make ourselves seem as though we're on top of the tree of life. So I often think if we shifted the metrics of what matters, humans maybe aren't at the top of the tree of life at all. Maybe the tree of life is simply not accurate. So for example, if echolocation was thought to make a species deserving of rights, we would rank relatively low and dolphins and bats would be doing fairly well. So I think we stacked the deck in some ways when we're thinking about animals and capabilities, because we choose the metrics that make us look good. And part of my thinking on this, there is an ant scientist. He wrote the book ants, and his name is Bert Hollenberger. I apologize, I'm getting that name incorrect. But I brought this idea to Bert very early. He's also at Arizona State University now as a long career and sometimes co-author of E.O. Wilson. And I was very nervous to present my tentative hypothesis to him years ago. And I thought he might say I was crazy to think that animals had this capacity to practice what was essentially property. And on the contrary, he said, no, in fact, animals have much more sophisticated social systems. Specifically, ants have much more sophisticated social systems than do other creatures, including humans. So one of the findings that I've made sort of in the journey of researching this book is displacing my notion of where humans fall on the pantheon of animals, and instead coming to understand that different creatures, animals, and other living creatures, including plants, are actually filled with these capacities that frankly are relatively hidden from the average person. And that when we look at them with fresh eyes, not assuming that being human-like is a criteria for anything, and sort of just neutrally learning what they do that might, for example, construct property-like behavior, we can learn that there's remarkable sophistication and capacity at even creatures like bacteria, right? These life forms that are thought to be relatively simplistic relative to humans, and yet they're exhibiting property-like behaviors that are remarkably sophisticated. My thinking about different species and different types of living things has been upended through this research, because I started with sort of no preconceived notions that humans were superior. I guess I did, but I was disabused of that notion quickly by scientists. And so by taking sort of a more neutral mindset that was divorced of an outcome, this wasn't an advocacy piece. I didn't start to reach the outcome that animals should be afforded property rights. I was really curious in the questions. I was able to find this rich set of information that showed that really the capacities question is in some ways, I think, falsely narrow, because it fails to recognize that animals on all limbs of the so-called trees of life are in fact doing really interesting and important things.
Thanks for sharing that. I think that really shows the value of this research for us as researchers, as well as for the wider world and for other scholars and students. There are so many questions that you raise in this book that we just don't have time to address. So, for example, I was really struck by your talk of animals selling land and buying land and selling access to land, and even the idea of animals being taxed on profits from land. But I just wanted to pick up on one thing you only mentioned a couple of times quite briefly, and that's the idea of copyright. So that really opens up the idea of animals owning property away from this idea of land towards the idea of intellectual property. Do you think that exploring the ideas as animals, as owners of intellectual property, could be another route towards realizing animals as property holders?
Absolutely. The copyright application of animals as property owners is in some way the solution to the problem of animal habitat, right? Many people say, well, if we give animals land, how can they afford the cost that a landowner must bear without exploiting the land to the point that the animals themselves cannot live on it? And the answer might rest in copyright. So in copyright law, one must be paid for the use of one's image, for example, or likeness for commercial purposes. And animals are exploited on this front all the time. So I don't want to get in trouble by using specific brand names, but I'm sure we can all call to mind many brand names that are directly derivative of or use the names of animals and the images of animals to promote commercial products. And as we think of those, one can imagine that if there were dollar values assigned to these commercial uses of animal imagery and animal sounds and other sort of creative output by animal, if we imagine commercializing that and simply paying animals for their contributions that are used for commercial purposes, just as we would for people, that becomes a tremendous revenue stream. I think the most interesting application of this, and something I'm really excited about, is that fashion has been looking at sustainability for some time. And given the demands of textiles and some of the issues surrounding fashion sustainability, there seems to be relatively limited, narrow, and somewhat not creative uses of fashion sustainability. So it's a very popular context for sustainability, but one in which the approaches have been relatively narrow. And something that I'm excited about is that I have been talking with a number of fashion brands interested in sustainability about using the copyright idea to informally, in a private governance sense, not in a litigation sense, to informally partner with fashion brands who are using things like leopard print on a pant, for example, and using those revenues to benefit animal charities. And I'm not talking about for sort of the very exploitative uses of animals. I'm very much talking about animal imagery that's not directly harming animals. So print patterns, for example, might be compensated through a proceed of sales, much in the way that a copyright regime legally would work, but as a system of private governance so that fashion brands can do something truly creative and also socially beneficial with their work.
I think that's a really brilliant idea, and I really look forward to seeing further work and further development in that area. Something that I've not thought about before and I've not come across before, but something that really struck me as exciting in the book. Now, we could talk for hours about this, but we do have a limited time frame on this podcast. So I'd like to move on to our 5 quick questions. So every guest on Knowing Animals is asked 5 quick questions. Are you ready?
I am.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
In my second year of college, I took a class on Native American studies and read about indigenous shamanistic practices around animals. And in the same semester, took a Scandinavian studies class about deep ecology. So, although I don't remember the names of these particular works, reading 2 very different veins of scholarship that were introducing radically different, to me, ideas about the relationship between humans and animals and humans and nature was simply a mind-blowing experience and radically began to shift my worldview.
That's a nice example of the advantages of the American university system, incidentally, because undergraduates in law here in the UK certainly wouldn't be reading that sort of thing, or not regularly, anyways.
It is a wonderful thing, sort of that interdisciplinary. And I was studying business at the time. So to take a class on Native American shamanism and Scandinavian studies ecology was, I think, a wonderful example of how those can sort of connect to ideas in other fields.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
In 2018, I published Animal Property Rights in Colorado Law Review.
And if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Martha Nussbaum, a philosopher in the United States, has been tremendously impactful in her animal thinking and her animal work. I really respect and like what she does.
Yes, and I noticed that the cover of your book bears a quote from her. She calls it the most original contribution to animal law in a long time.
That was wildly exciting when I saw that blurb. Totally unexpected, but wildly exciting. She has a book called Animal Justice coming out that I cannot wait to read.
What's the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
I think we need to use our position and our privileges and our platform to paint a vision of a new future with animals, something radically new and different, to imagine what that might look like, and then to use the skills and specializations that we have to lay the path between where we are and the future we'd like to get to.
And if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I'd like us to think of animals as our teachers and to begin to watch the ways in which animals interact with the natural environment, their resources, and one another, and to think critically, not just simply to accept what we see, but to think critically about what we can learn from other living things on this planet.
What is it you're working on next?
I have 2 projects. The first is one on overlapping property rights. We recently had a journal volume come out in International Journal of the Commons, which had 8 fantastic papers by different scholars thinking about new ways of envisioning property to shift away from this binary owner, non-owner, and to adopt a more inclusive view of property that can accept it in far more forms, which I think better reflects the reality, but also holds important social justice and animal interests. The other thing I'm working on is about rights of nature. Contrary to popular belief, there are actually widespread rights of nature in the United States today, and I'm really excited to uncover those and share those with a broader audience.
So how can people find out more about your work?
The easiest way is my website, kmbradshaw.com, and I do offer free signed book plates there for anyone who asks for one for their copy of my book. I'm also on Twitter at km_Bradshaw.
Well, Karen, thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Knowing Animals.
Josh, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.